Hello and welcome to Sync Music Matters, a podcast that explores the beautiful relationship between music and the moving image. My name's Jim Holstrip and I'm your host on this journey, as each week I chew the fat with industry professionals who, on a daily basis, work with music for visuals. Now you might immediately assume that I'm talking about composers, but I'm also talking about editors, music supervisors, directors, and anyone else who's involved with the synchronous process of pairing audio and visuals. In today's episode, I'm talking to TV, film and theatre composer Isobel Waller-Bridge. So, what can you expect from today's chat? Well, Isobel reveals how she finds musical inspiration in pretty much anything but music. In fact, when talking about inspiration, she tends to reference people like Francis Bacon, Tilda Swinton and Carson. But she also shows her love for composers like Ennio Moriccone, Danny Elfman, Gustav Mahler and Wendy, amongst others. We dig into the prevalence of drone-based music in modern score and her love for it, that and Detroit Techno. We go under the skin with her work on the Netflix series Munich, The Edge of War, as well as her recent project with the Philharmonia as part of their climate change season. We also talk about her electronic score for Vita and Virginia, and how the instructions from director Chanya Button were lasers and no piano. Isobel also reveals why she's petrified of monkeys. As ever, all the music mentioned in this episode is linked in the show notes, which you can find on your preferred podcast platform or in a slightly more digestible format on my website, larpmusic.com/Sync Music Matters Podcast. And of course, Sync Music Matters Podcast is hyphenated. Alternatively, you could just go to larpmusic.com and click on podcast in the menu. It's probably a bit easier. Isobel Waller-Bridge is an award-winning composer and sound designer for TV, film and theatre. Her recent TV soundtracks include Emma, Black Mirror, the episode Rachel, Jack and Ashley 2, Vanity Fair, Vita and Virginia, The Split and Fleabag. And recent theatre credits include Wojciech at the Old Vic and Knives in Hens at the Donmar Warehouse. Isobel's eclectic scores move seamlessly between sweeping orchestral and analogue electronica, often blurring the lines between music and sound design. She won Best Composer at Underwire Film Festival and winner of Best Sound Designer at Off West End Theatre Awards. Isobel likes to flex her electric pop chops and has even been arranging strings for Norwegian artist Aurora and was commissioned by the Philharmonia to write music as part of their climate change season. Isobel Waller-Bridge.
Hello.
Thanks for joining Sync Music Matters.
Thank you for such a nice introduction.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's
pop chops is the first. I like that.
Pop chops, yes, pop chops. Absolutely. The Philharmonia isn't quite so poppy as writing for Aurora, but still.
Yeah.
So the first question I kind of like to start off with for everyone is, if we were to sort of rewind to when you were a young girl, somewhere sort of, I don't know, between 5 and 10, if someone had asked you, what would you like to be when you grow up, what would you have replied?
Oh, gosh. Well, this is going to sound absolutely mad, but probably when I was at 5, I started learning the piano when I was 4. And then, I'm not kidding, but all the photos of me when I was younger are all music. I'm either sitting on someone's knee at the piano, I'm either banging something or strumming on something, and I think I was also really interested in art history and art, and so one of the things that I was thinking about doing was actually becoming a curator, which I would have loved to have done. I mean, I wouldn't want to do it now. I feel quite committed to the thing that I'm doing, but that always really interested me. And I think, basically I think music and visual art have always been really strong. So there was always like a musical thread, certainly artistic thread, but very heavily musical. Yeah, really, really musical all the way from the beginning.
So at what point because I've had this conversation with a few people, and I think certainly for me growing up, music was never presented as a possibility, as a career. At what point did you kind of realise that, music could have potentially be a viable career? Or were you thinking of it in terms of career, or just as in, I love this, I'm going to do it?
I don't think I was thinking about it as a career until much later. I think I realised that it was what I wanted to do, but the idea of actually earning a living from it was that was a dream that I was really trying not to I was trying to keep my kind of expectations quite low and realised that I really enjoy doing it, and it gives me a lot of strength and pleasure and all of those things. But I was quite prepared to maybe be an academic, actually, is what I thought I might do. That was later on when I got to university, and then I was going to go and do a PhD and thought about kind of going down that route. But when I was at school, it wasn't really suggested as a kind of career, I don't think. Even though we were taught about composers, we weren't really we weren't talking about the kind of film composers, and I was listening to them and getting really obsessed with like Morricone, but they were so far away. They were, I couldn't imagine it. And then I was quite a serious pianist, so I did think about perhaps, but my technique was never that good. So I knew that I'd be a different kind of player. I wouldn't be your kind of really traditional player. So it was not until later.
Yeah. Is there a different mindset between, say, being a concert pianist or like a musician versus being a composer?
Well, I think the discipline, they both, being a composer, being a musician, I think requires like the same amount of kind of discipline, but the way it's sort of, the practice of it is quite different, I think. Or maybe it's not. I mean, I don't know how qualified I am to talk about being a musician, because I really only do it, I play only occasionally and perform only occasionally. But when I was being really serious about it, I was practicing for kind of 9 or 10 hours a day. No joke. Wow. Like really, and loved it so much. And that kind of structure really appealed to me, and going really deep into something. And with composing, it's a kind of strange, with practicing and with, you feel the improvements of it kind of almost instantly. I think like you practice something over and over and over and over and over again, and then you can sort of do it better. But with composing, I feel like I have to do a lot of thinking and a lot of sitting and looking out the window. Yeah. And then eventually I'll start writing. So it's like the energy is different.
Yeah, sure.
But the time is the same.
Okay. That would segue nicely into sort of talking about your process, but something else I just want to sort of come back to is you mentioned sort of the idea of academia, because you studied music at university, didn't you? And then you actually did a master's as well. Now, I think this is as much for me as it is anything else, but I think in the past have been quite surprised by, when I've had sort of interns, been surprised by how many of them have finished a degree and then gone on to do a master's. And I think I have been guilty of being sort of quite scathing about the sort of the doing of the master's. I'm sort of like, and this is probably speaks mainly to the fact that I'm sort of more an apprenticeship kind of guy, and I'm like, we're learning on the job rather than sort of studying. Do you feel that doing the master's stood you in better stead later on? It's
a really interesting one, because straight after I did my master's, I then sort of basically did an apprenticeship with a film composer, and the difference in the rate of learning was quite extreme, I think, because it was really the deep end. Like, the master's really fed my curiosity and gave me loads of time and space to kind of explore ideas on my own, and being supervised by people I really respected, by the composers that I really respected. So George Benjamin and Sylvina Milstein. And so that gave me that sort of, I felt like that gave me a kind of autonomy over my own voice and my work, and really I really just gave me the time to kind of I got really into spectral music and music concrete, and then that actually made me want to do sound design for theatre. So I wonder, without that learning and without that time to learn. But then, having said that, I think if you're curious about things, I don't think you need to necessarily go and do a master's to have the time to do it. I think I still am up until 4 a.m. kind of going down like wormholes about like, pieces of music that I've heard, or, composers that I like.
So we finished the master's. What was the sort of then progression to working, sort of doing your apprenticeship and sort of into music?
When I was just finishing my masters, that was the kind of thing of, oh God, like, what am I going to do? You know, that's like, what do you do for money? Essentially, like, how am I going to earn a living? I was doing like every temp job under the sun. Literally, I was like working at the stock exchange on reception. I was like working in like Selfridges on the shop floor. I was like literally doing everything. And then I applied for a job at the London Chamber Orchestra because I noticed that they weren't playing any new music. And like doing the masters, we were really wanting to collaborate with London ensembles or London orchestras. So I asked the London Chamber Orchestra whether I could come and start a young composers scheme with them, and that the deal would be that they can maybe play some of my music as well as playing other young composers. And then I partnered that with the National Gallery, that scheme. And then I invited composers to come in. So it was George Fenton and Graham Fitkin and Cheryl Frances Hode and Ruth Wall, and composers from lots of different disciplines. And then from that, I was running that scheme really with the London Chamber Orchestra for probably about a year, I think, while I was sort of coming to the end of my masters. Ditched the PhD idea. George Fenton was one of the composers who I had invited to come and speak to the group of young composers that were having their music performed by the orchestra. And I asked him whether I could come and assist him. And he said yes. And then I assisted him for about 5 years. And that was how that happened.
I love that. It's almost you identified a kind of an opportunity where there was a lack of new music and sort of thought, okay, well, what can I do to sort of help change that? And then out of that just came sort of numerous, well, one particular opportunity, particularly to go and become a sort of apprentice. It was that proactive approach of sort of going, okay, what can I do?
Well, definitely the kind of proactive, forever, really. It's like even when I was at school, you know, playing as much as possible, you know, I was always sort of like playing other people's music or writing for other people. And then certainly at university kind of started a collective with a few other composers, and we would perform like in like really dodgy places, you know, like at Edinburgh, you know, but great, like that was the stuff, you know, it was kind of really like in the middle of the night in some random, you know, something that used to be a kind of public loo or something, you know, like, or really at the back of a pub. And then same thing with theatre when I started, you know, we were doing exactly the same thing. So that proactive nature has always been really central to, I think, everything that I've done. I've never been a wait for it person. No. Always been a go.
Well, I think the music industry, possibly slightly more the commercial side of things, but there is an element of, you know, waiting for the big break. But actually that kind of proactive attitude and proactive nature, it means that you create opportunities from which a break can arise, and obviously kind of completely worked out in your favour. But as well, it sounds like, you know, it's you mentioned curiosity earlier, and you just sort of constantly been sort of curious about, oh, what can I do? What can we explore? What, you know, and I wonder if do you feel that that's because it's almost kind of like that slightly kind of visionary side of you where you're sort of looking at, okay, what can we do, that maybe feeds into kind of, rather than being a performing musician, being a composer? Because I always think with musicians are, they, like, you know, you do work practicing 9-10 hours a day on their craft, but I know loads of musicians who don't feel comfortable sort of writing music because they're very much sort of they're sort of masters of their own instrument, whereas I think with composers sometimes there's slightly more of a kind of like a visionary thing. It's like I'm decidedly average at lots of instruments. I'm not particularly good at any kind of instruments. But
you're really good at guitars. What are you talking about? You're like an amazing guitarist.
No. Well, thank you. It's very kind of you to say. But I just always think that I've always had a mind whereby it's kind of like there's been a vision, and that's kind of what's driven me, rather than sort of pursuit of excellence on an instrument. But it's interesting what you say as well about how with composition you don't get that kind of immediate feedback of thinking, oh yeah, I'm getting better at this. It's whereas you do when you're sort of practicing.
Yeah, definitely. And I wonder whether the because that's the thing. It's not just been kind of for opportunities. It is the visionary. I think you're right in terms of, I really agree with that in terms of the visionary thing, because I have this kind of folder on my computer of projects that I want to do. And they go back, 10 years, maybe more, or like the seeds of the ideas started. And I'm just waiting for the right time, really, like creatively, like when I feel like that could, but they're really detailed ideas. And some of them, there's one project that really was an idea from about 8 or 9 years ago. That is possibly just about to happen. And that there's all, if somebody says, oh, is there anything kind of kicking around that you thought that you might like to do? There always is. I've always had some sort of, and I wonder, it's really interesting that, because I think part of for me anyway, the composing thing is like a sort of response to another art form. So, because it's been really interesting, I signed a record deal and I've been trying to write this album and I'm finding it really difficult. And I realize it's because I'm not responding. I'm not collaborating with something else. I'm only, it's just me. And so I've really had to go on a proper sort of figure out a process for that. And all the other projects, they're specifically like inspired by an artist's work that it's that kind of stuff.
So it's almost harder when you've got carte blanche than when you've actually got a brief or you are responding to visuals or a narrative that exists already.
I'm finding it very challenging. Well,
I suppose particularly if you kind of get very used to working in that way, if you sort of constantly responding to someone's work and then all of a sudden someone goes, hey, do you know what? You can now do whatever you want. You're like, ooh.
Yeah. And
it's an idea.
Definitely. And I remember the first meeting with the label, who I love so much, and they've been so supportive actually, because they completely get it. The first meeting I had with them, I was like, I don't know what to, I feel like this has to be kind of an expression of my whole life. And they were like, no. Just, pick an experience or pick a, you can be micro in the genesis, in the idea that kind of sparks it all. It doesn't have to be kind of really broad. It can be quite specific. But I found it really, really difficult. And also because, I don't know, it's a weird one though. It's because I psych myself out. So I'll write, I've got like 70 pieces that I've kind of started just like noodles on the piano and like starting to develop. But it's also related to a deadline thing. I think without having a hard deadline, I really find it difficult to. This deadline is so part of my process. It's like the first thing that I need to know.
So you basically need this record label to come back and say, we need this album by next week, and then you'll dig deep. You'll basically do like 2 weeks worth of all-nighters and come up with the goods at the end of it.
Basically that. Well, actually, the thing that happened, which has made it's like I know that I'm going to have to write it now, is because the South Bank Centre asked me if I wanted to do a performance as part of their Purcell Sessions, which is this series of concerts that they put on in the Purcell Room.
Which is in May next year?
In May next year, yeah. And I was like, I definitely want to do it because I really love performing. I don't do it enough, and it's like I'd really look forward to it. But I was thinking, God, like, what am I going to perform? And then I was like, this is perfect. This is absolutely perfect, because I know now that I have to have finished it all before the concert, so I can then maybe release some of it and then practice it and then perform it. So it's like,
there's your deadline.
Yeah, and that is very classic of me, actually, is just something that is really, really terrifying.
Yeah, so if something gets you out of your comfort zone, that's a positive thing.
It is. It can be really painful though, and there's like in terms of that process, like every time I start a new project, I'm always really insecure at the beginning. I tend to kind of call my agent at some point and be like, this is terrible. And then it's just every time, and I recognize that now, and then I send off the first bunch of stuff, the feedback comes back, and it's usually, I'm not, it's okay. I'm doing it. And
so just going back to, because I think I'm quite interested. So you've got this album where you can literally just do anything. Where do you start with that? What's the kind of beginning process? Do you start sort of just immersing yourself in sort of music, or do you just sit down at a piano? And then how does that then differ from how you would approach, say, a film or a TV show?
Actually, if I start with the process of the film and the TV, because it's something that I know, so I'm much more kind of well-versed in it, I guess.
Something you've worked out already, you're still working.
Yeah, exactly. And then I applied that. Basically, I'll start with that because then I had to apply it to the album. But where possible, I really love to be on board as you know, they could still be at script stage. And what I'll tend to do is read the script, have a conversation with the director, and whoever else is kind of creatively kind of brought into that. Sometimes it's a producer, you know, it's definitely the production designer, you know, because the aesthetics are really connected to the music for me. And I think, you know, I'm sure a lot of people would agree with that. And so then I'll be sent kind of stills, or I'll ask for kind of paintings or colours or something that, you know, if they haven't shot anything yet, something that that I can look at to start a kind of visual exploration, which then kind of translates itself into sound. And then I'll pick a scene from if we're still working from script stage, I'll pick a scene or pick, you know, a moment, and I'll just try and kind of, I'll just sit down, always at the piano, really, and start messing around with stuff. And then I'll start getting creative with that and then bring it into the box and start kind of playing with it. Basically, I think the way I always work is I'll have like really in-depth kind of creative chats, and then I will always write away from the picture. So then I'll take the sketches that have just come from the inspiration from the conversations and from the aesthetics and from the story and from the journey that I know that the characters go on, and then I'll apply it to the picture. But then actually I just did a film called Munich, and the director did an amazing thing actually at the beginning. I was on that film for a long time, actually. It was like 9 months. So we were at script stage. And he asked me, he gave me 5 headline words that for him relate to the journey of the story of the film, and asked me to write a kind of theme or one, you know, piece of music that relates to, that expresses those words. And they were quite broad. You know, it was kind of family. I mean, really, really, you know, that broad. And so actually a film that I've just started working on, I've kind of brought that process in. And so one of the words that, you know, we're thinking about is trauma, because that's a big part of the film. And so I'm just immersing myself in that kind of what that sounds like. So it really is a responsive kind of process.
And what does trauma sound like?
Well, at the moment, it sounds actually it's not loud at the moment. It's not loud. It's quite dense, but it's not like a very vertical sound for me at the moment. And it's not a piano sound, you know, it's not, I don't think it's like, it doesn't have the warmth or I don't know, something that it's more abstract.
Colder.
Yeah.
And it's interesting as well, I suppose, because it's interesting you're starting with a sort of like a key emotion, because obviously when you're writing music, particularly to picture, I think, well, but generally any type of music, it's all about emotion. It's eliciting an emotion in the person who's listening. So you've identified one key emotion, and it's interesting as well. It sounds like are you kind of still kind of adapting your process? You're taking a learning from one film and sort of going, hey, that worked really well for me. Let's try and sort of use that.
But I think I'll be doing that until I'm 90, hopefully. You know what I mean? Always always evolving. And I think that's also, that feeds back into why I'm always kind of reaching out for the new, like for different kind of projects, and also really enjoy doing kind of different genres, because it keeps me on my toes. But to answer the other part of your question about the album process, that the first thing that I think the first thing that I do, I really love Carson, who's a writer and a poet, and I'm really obsessed with the Greeks. I really feel like my kind of life and work motto is go Greek or go home, in terms of, so I really feel like, and I really, really love those stories and how the world is, we're all, you know, we operate on the same scale as the Greeks did in those stories. And anyway, but Carson writes a lot about them. So I went to her, because I'm writing lyrics as well. And so I went to her work and actually wrote to her and told her that I was doing this. And drew a lot of inspiration from the way she structures her poems and a lot of the imagery in her poems.
So is that, are you talking, so the way she uses words and sort of structures that, you're incorporating that similar sort of structure within music, or is there lyrics to this with the album as well?
Sort of both. There are lyrics to the album because I don't really think of myself as a lyricist. So of course, the first thing I was like, I think I should try and write some lyrics. Let's go. It's just like a nightmare. But and there were some words, there were some sentences, but I've done this before, you know, if I'm reading, like for titles, often I'll open a novel that I feel is close to the piece that I've written in some sort of way, and I'll just choose 3 words next to each other from a page. So I kind of took that a bit further with Anne Carson's work, but really the structure of a poem. Like if it was in like 3 verses, or I mean not verses, like stanzas, you know, but then and then as I was kind of using her work, I was sort of getting a bit more confidence, and so then I was departed, which is also sometimes I find that's an interesting way to write music. You know, if I'm really stuck, I'll go to a piece of work that exists, I know, and then I'll be inspired by it, and then obviously move away from it and you make it your own. So it's similar with the words.
It's fascinating as well. I mean, we touched on it off air before as well, but it sounds like, I think sometimes when you think about being musically creative, you tend to sort of think about music, but actually it sounds like you're going everywhere but music.
Oh yeah.
To find sort of creative inspiration. Where else do you kind of go when you're kind of looking for that inspiration?
Well, yeah, do you know what? That's so funny that you asked that, because I did an interview and someone said, who are your like, but most, you know, who inspires you the most? And I think they were expecting a big list of composers, and it was like, I was like Francis Bacon, Tilda Swinton, Francesca Woodman, who's this wonderful American photographer who died when she was very young, Virginia Woolf, you know, the list goes on, Anne Carson, the list really kind of is...
non-music at all.
Yeah, there's no music in there. And then when I think about it, I'm thinking actually like who? And then if I go back, I'm like Eric Satie, of course, is like that. His music is really important to me, but it's not the music that I used to. Yeah, it's not really music. I love listening to music. I listen to classical music probably more than I listen to any other genre. But it's like books.
I suppose that kind of makes for. It's a unique approach in that you're drawing on creative inspiration, which isn't necessarily even audio, but to take that creative inspiration and then interpret it musically, you're perhaps not drawing on the same inspiration that I think most people would draw on. Certainly, I think myself as well. I definitely believe in finding inspiration outside of music, but I do rely on sort of quite heavily on sort of musical influence. But I think that in terms of if finding a unique voice is about, you know, taking all of the influences and combining them in a unique way, your influences are sort of not even musical. It's just purely sort of artistic expression. It's like, okay, well, how can I tell that story musically?
Yeah, but I think at the beginning I probably was quite influenced. Like I think what I was fed musically when I was at school and like growing up, but it's kind of what I was fed, but also what I wanted to eat. You know, it was like Mahler, and I don't know if you find this, but I actually feel like when I'm working, I don't listen to that much music because I'm really scared sometimes that it's going to turn up. You know, there's so many stories when like there's a pianist that sat down and been like, oh yeah, those are good chords, and then they realise it's Let It Be or something.
Yeah. Well, I think from my point of view, one of the reasons I don't listen to music much when I'm working is because I just spend all day listening to music and make my own music, and it's like the last thing. It's, you know, it changes your relationship with music when you're making it all day. Is that like in my downtime, it's quite rare that I sort of go, oh, put on some music. It's actually when I take a bit of time off that I sort of go, I'm going on holiday. I'm like, oh, cool, let's listen to some.
Yeah, totally. I'm exactly the same. And I have it because my partner listens to a lot of like she listens to a lot of kind of loud music.
Loud as in sort of like techno or metal?
No, she's actually got the best. I love the music, but it's PJ Harvey, and it's so brilliant. But I've had many an awkward taxi journey when I've asked for, like, could we possibly turn the music kind of down, off. Yeah. And but I like sitting in silence. I don't think it's that. I think it's okay.
Definitely. And is that something that you, because obviously you're kind of drawing on different influences, is that something that you kind of think of consciously in terms of are you consciously looking to try and create something new and unique each time? Or is it just kind of is it an organic process? I
think I'm probably looking to sort of stretch myself, what can I do that is interesting to me? And of course, like, the audience to me has always been the most important part of making work. Like, it really, really is. And so, because that is a relationship, whether it's theatre or cinema, or any other, whether it's novels or, I don't know I can't speak for the way novelists feel, but for me, definitely as a musician, the audience is really key. So I do probably think a little bit about what might be interesting to someone, to hear, but it's got to start with where I feel like I want to go with an idea, because I think, and sometimes I don't want to be like really experimental. I wrote something for the Philharmonia that it was so experimental and so kind of it was so, like, it was really noisy, it was really experimental, it was like so much kind of fun to write, but it was very aggressive, I think, and deliberately, and I really wanted to write that, and I knew that that's what I was going to write from the minute the commission came in. I was like, I've got a 90-piece orchestra, I'm not going to write a sweet little, I just knew that's not what I wanted to do. But I was, after that piece, I think I even wrote to my manager, and I was like, I think for the next few months I'm just going to write really beautiful things.
Interesting.
I really was like, I think, but I don't know if you find this when you come off a project, when you end a project, there is
saturation.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm always a bit wobbly at the end of when a project finishes, and it's always because I've kind of made that project my home, and then that home goes away, and I have to look for home. And I always slightly feel like I need a soft padded place to kind of land, not like...
Yeah, sort of decompress.
Yeah.
Under the skin. So, like, what sort of... Just talk us through that a bit in terms of, okay, so this was kind of like a loud and slightly more abstract and off the wall. How do you go about sort of creating that for an orchestra? And can you talk a bit more about sort of, I know it's quite hard to sort of describe something stylistically, but how would you sort of describe it? What were the different instruments doing? And I suppose, what were you leaving the audience with? Because you talk about the relationship with the audience. It's like, what did you want the audience to feel?
Well, really helpfully, that the commission was part of the Philharmonia's climate change series. So I already had something to write about. So I just went and researched loads of different aspects of climate change and the sort of technical parts of it. And then I found this thing called a feedback loop and then went into that and then sort of basically found an area that I really wanted to zone in on and wrote these 4 movements that related to those areas. So that was absolutely, like, as a kind of process, being given a brief, that's kind of was a really good starting point. And then I thought I knew that I wanted it to end as this kind of mad, like, dark rave, like an orchestra, like all of us, like, dancing crazily, like, on this planet, and we're with plastic and emissions, and there's so much good work being done, but there's something about the wild kind of abandon of kind of responsibility that we've experienced in the past. It has, it's changing now, obviously, much for the better. So I knew that that's where I was going, and I knew that I usually always write for strings, and strings are my total love and where I feel most at home. So totally true to form. I was like, so this time I'm going to write for brass mainly. They're going to be the main feature. And so I had those things figured out, and then I knew at the beginning, because I wanted it to be a real journey, I wanted to start like so small, like the smallest I could possibly start, like almost like you couldn't hear it. Not confusingly quiet, but like
not just complete silence.
Just silence, yeah, exactly. But so I knew that, and I knew that I wanted it to be beautiful at moments, because I wanted there to be a shock. I didn't want it to be tonal, because also, like, I think actually that piece was a real opportunity. I made it into an opportunity it was a reaction against a lot of the tonal music that I'd been writing for films. And it all through my master's and at university, I had been writing very atonal music and was obsessed with it, absolutely loved it, and and that was also why I do sound design, because I get the atonality, world is like, I can do that more in sound design than I can. And something like Emma, the film, was such a wonderful opportunity to write a really tonal score, like so beautiful, like proper big tunes, like wonderful sound. And I loved every minute of it. It was like really stunning. And then to be able to be asked to write that kind of music was so classical, and it was such a kind of privilege, really.
And then you've got the sort of even further contrast there of sort of like Vita and Virginia, which was entirely electronic, wasn't it? So
yeah.
There wasn't a string in sight.
No, well, there were two.
Two.
There were two.
Two strings.
There were two strings. There were two. Yeah, that was my first film score, really. And that process was wild, because when I was first asked to do the film, on face value, I thought, it's going to be a period drama. Like, it's going to just be, it's going to be that. And I think I suddenly started listening to kind of a lot of, like Atonement and, these kinds of scores. And then Chania, the director, said that she didn't want anything, because the story is full of such kind of beauty and longing and romance. She said she didn't want that, the music to kind of layer anything, add another kind of layer to that. She wanted the music to speak to the spirit of the women.
Yeah. And so interesting that you mentioned there. So talking about the sort of like the difference between sort of carte blanche when you're working on an album and working with someone, you said that sort of Chania sort of she obviously had a clear vision for what she wanted. How does that does it make life easier when the director has a sort of a clear vision versus if they're sort of a bit more kind of laissez-faire?
I like it when a director has a clear vision. I've definitely worked with directors who are much more kind of feel like they want to kind of give you the reins a bit more, but I feel like it's useful because the director is overseeing. It makes sense to me that a director would have a vision, and I do really appreciate it, because it just lets me, and it doesn't have to be a kind of very fleshed out vision, it can just be, Chania's was very, very specific, although it wasn't, the only thing that she said was she said that she wanted lasers and she didn't want a piano. So I was like, okay, lasers. So lasers turned into electronics, and there was no, and then she didn't want a piano, so there's no piano, and that was great. But I think I do think it's useful. I do think it's useful if there is a vision. But I also, you don't want to be micromanaged either. So it's kind of, that can get a bit frustrating. So it's a balance, yeah.
Yeah, sure. You mentioned earlier about the kind of that importance between the music and the audience. How do you, has it ever happened that something hasn't been received well by an audience? And if so, how do you manage that?
oh God, I remember there was like, I've done some, actually, like, some of the theatre that I've done, sometimes, it's not like a hit, but it's kind of, you're all kind of in it together. If anyone starts to like single you out, like there was one time I was pretty young. I'll never forget it. These things never leave you as well. So I have a real
trauma.
Yeah, definitely. Because it's like, and then you have to make a decision about whether you're going to read reviews and what do they mean to you and how do you feel about critics, and it's all quite noisy stuff. But I remember there was a critic. I'd done a play at Chichester, and I'd really enjoyed it. I thought it was like we all had a sort of nice time, and I'd written this kind of slightly jazzy score, and there was one critic who hated it, absolutely hated it, and I was like really devastated. And then I became really like precious about that stuff, and I did another thing for theatre. I was like cutting my teeth, so it was all really formative and it was healthy stuff, really good in a way. I did one other show. It was like at the where was it? It was the small theatre at the Trafalgar Studios, and there was a critic who said something like they didn't really think that what I'd done kind of supported the scene changes enough or something. And but it wasn't even like it wasn't even a terror. I just took it so badly, and I really had to kind of think about what my relationship is with reviews, because of course, if someone sends me, like, I love the good reviews. Like who doesn't love a good review?
Well, I suppose there's a difference as well, because obviously even working with a director, you sometimes send a cue and they don't like it gets rejected, and even that's difficult, but at least it's not public. I think it's when it's public, it probably makes it that bit more difficult to sort of take, when you've sort of been publicly flogged rather than just flogged behind closed doors.
And I don't mind. It's such a sort of like, it's so different, because if I'm collaborating with someone and they say I don't like it, I'm like, okay, that's fine. Like I really I feel so different about that. It's like a completely different brain, or I'm a different, because you're collaborating, and that's a process that you both go on, and then you land on something that is working, and then we're all happy. But there was something that kind of really irked me about just, a critic sort of getting the train up from London, going to a show and just being like, I didn't, because also I'm like, but what, maybe they were hungry. Maybe they just had a crap day. But no, maybe they just didn't like the work. And that was the thing. And I was like, no, actually, probably. And then I listened to that score. I mean, this honestly was about 12 years ago, and I still remember it. So, and I listened to the score again. I don't think it's that bad, but I could probably, I don't know.
Well, this is something that Stephen Warbeck talked about. He was saying that, there is no right and wrong.
Yeah.
There is, if you give the same cue to 20 different composers, they'll all approach it in a different way. And then none of those are right and wrong. It's just what resonates with that director. And one thing's really nice is you're talking about it as very much a collaboration, which I think is a really good takeaway for me, because I do tend to take it personally, but you're very much seeing it as like this is a journey of exploration between two or maybe even more people. And within that, it's like trial and error. We sort of like, we play with it and we sort of, and without being too attached to a particular idea. And when someone says, don't feel that's quite working, it's like, oh, okay, fair enough. And what Stephen said, which was really interesting, is that sometimes that process actually forces you to sort of go and explore areas that you otherwise might not have explored, which can only be, a good thing. That's
totally true. It's totally true. I really agree with that. And constructive criticism is always good, which is the collaborative stuff.
Yeah, sure.
But just someone being like, oh, it wasn't for me, you go, okay, well then that's okay.
That's great. But, there were 500 other people in that theatre and they might have liked it. So.
Maybe they liked it. Maybe. Yeah. I'll never know.
No. You mentioned earlier as well about when you kind of start a new project that you sometimes, particularly at the beginning of it, it sounds like you experience quite a bit of sort of self-doubt. How have you do you have any sort of particular sort of strategies for coping with that, and how And has that changed since you started out? You know, you're talking about this project. This was 12 years ago. Does it get any easier? And have you sort of worked out coping strategies, or is it always the same?
I wish it was different. I wish it had become different. The only thing that has really improved is that I can see it, and I know exactly. I pretty much now know what I'm going to experience at each stage, like down to the weeks, really, of
the 7 pillars of Isobel's sort of composing.
Yeah, it's literally that. Oh my God, it really is literally that. And I know that I know that the only way is through. You know, you can't go over it and you can't like go under it. You just have to go through it. And it's like that thing of like stepping into the abyss, and starting a project is, I get sweaty palms just actually thinking about it. It's really exciting, and there's so much of it that is like thrilling. But when you've had all the conversations and you've looked at all the material and you've read the script, when it's just then you in the studio and you have to sit down and you go, what does this sound like? And then committing to something. It's hours and hours and hours. And I refuse sometimes to leave the studio until I've done something.
Oh, really? You won't step away. It's like you will. It's like the sort of head teacher. You will sit there and you will keep working until you've done something worthwhile.
I have to. And then sometimes I actually used to do things like, if I was stuck, because my studio is not at home anymore, but when my studio was at home, if I was stuck, I would begin the day again. So I'd have a shower, change my clothes, sometimes like have breakfast. You know, I would literally begin again, or change. If I woke up and I'd like had some cereal, if I was doing it again, instead of having the cereal, I'd go for a walk around the block or some. You know, but I don't do that so much anymore. But that worked.
That's really interesting, because that's obviously kind of off the back of, well, I say hopefully off the back of coronavirus. Hopefully we're sort of at the end of this, but who knows? There's obviously a lot of people who have never worked from home, who haven't experienced what it's like to not have that clear mental separation between now I'm at home, now I'm at work. And when those two environments become confused, it sounds like you were taking deliberate steps to sort of go, right, I'm going to have a shower, I'm going to get changed, I'm going to go for a walk around the block and then come back, hoping by doing so that you're going to kind of create some mental separation from, you know, now I'm back to work. But yeah, I think there's probably a lot of people around the world at the moment, sort of in the early phase. You know, it starts off as a novelty. Oh yeah, cool, work from home, don't have to commute, blah, 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 blah. But then weird shit happens over a period of time of working from home, and probably sort of reaching.
Yeah, and about the blurred, like the lines of work and home, it's like pajamas, basically. You know, it's just like when you're just staying in your pajamas and working. And sometimes, you know, that's a good thing. Sometimes that's like, you know, sometimes that's what you need to do. That
was the best thing about coronavirus, is I could wear tracksuit bottoms for basically 18 months.
Exactly. Totally.
Yeah, interesting. And has it got any easier? Do you find it easier today or is it just the fact that you know you've got those stages to sort of push through? It's like, okay, well, I know I've got to go through. I just got to go through it.
I find that what actually is what is a big thing for me is there's part of me that thinks that the older I get, I don't want to ever be safe in terms of, you know, that doesn't mean like I don't want to ever write anything that is traditional, because I love writing those things, and I love writing things that are, you know, that move me and hopefully move other people, and quiet things. But I think what I mean is I don't ever want to repeat myself. I think that's more of it, because I feel like when I was younger, I didn't really know very much. And I was very I was just doing things and experimenting and writing whatever came to mind. And I didn't have the critic wasn't very, the self kind of critic wasn't very evolved. And now it is quite evolved, which is good and bad, because I kind of know how to deal with it more. But when I'm going into a project, I feel like I want to always be reaching for something that and that it's not like it doesn't get that I'm just really aware of, I think.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting as well is it sounds like that whilst because this is something I get hung up on, is sort of like irreverence and trying to do things differently. But it sounds like what you're doing is, rather than sort of going, okay, this is, what's the end product going to be and how's that going to be different? It almost sounds like you're just looking at, how can I find a different starting point, a different foundation on which to build, which strikes me as being actually the way to do something unique. The way to do it is to sort of challenge yourself to come at it from a starting point of, where's a new place to start from, rather than, okay, how's it going to sound, in a few weeks when I've sort of done the first things.
I think that does feel kind of true.
Getting a taste. I just quickly love to sort of get a taste for because I always think, what you mean, we've drawn it before. You talked about what you were fed at home in terms of music, and you mentioned Mahler. Are there other kind of not necessarily film scores, but other kind of seminal albums or pieces of music or experiences with music which you feel have sort of helped shape you today as a person, but also in terms of what resonates with you musically and what you put out into the world?
For me, like the big hitters were at the beginning, like Mahler, basically all the kind of very kind of late romantic composers. And then Morricone, Danny Elfman, like Edward Scissorhands, I just... and then, but, I really love the kind of journey, watching the kind of culture, basically, of film scoring kind of evolve, because I'll never forget when The Social Network came out. No, actually, it was before that. It was when American Beauty, it was that, and it was Thomas Newman, and it was when that score, for me anyway, changed so much, because before we'd had all these big tunes, and then that was a huge, and that actually kind of started, I feel, like a kind of post-classical idea,
And where do you feel film score is now, culturally speaking?
Well, I don't know, because I've been talking to kind of friends, it's like, and actually talking to directors about it, because when they're thinking about vision for the music for their film, they talk about, it's not that they're talking about where they think the culture is, but it's just interesting what they kind of instinctively feel like they want, that is fresh, which is how, culture then reveals itself. I suppose there's been quite a lot of kind of drone music, I suppose, in the last 5 years.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of peaked with June. Have you seen June?
No, I haven't seen it yet.
So it's fantastic. I mean, it plays into what you're saying. It's very much sort of kind of synth-led, fairly atonal drone,
nice.
But creates an incredible soundscape and adds, ramps up the intensity of everything beautifully. I think, because you mentioned atonal music, and like when you were sort of at university, you kind of, are there sort of like certain electronic music producers that you were sort of into, or sort of you can think of?
Well, I like Detroit Techno, really specifically. Detroit Techno.
I don't even know what Detroit Techno is.
It's just, I kind of won't go into the like sort of, because someone will know more than me, but I just know that I really love that sound world and those producers. But I also, Daniel Avery, John Hopkins, the thing that kind of joins, I think, those artists is that it's not like clean sounds, it's not just like an electronic sound. And I've always been in a much more kind of like crunchy, I always like the crunchy places. So I guess, but now I feel like what I'm really interested in is kind of, basically, with film scores, for me personally, I really love some sort of a hook. So if it's like, even in a drone world, you could have a hook. And I think that's just, and it sounds so obvious, but I think that is just really important. And if it's like even one sound, if it's like incredibly minimal and you maybe only have 3 or 4 kind of identifiable sounds, those sounds might be made up of kind of hundreds of layers of things, but then it's like that kind of, it's like clarity, basically. So having, and it doesn't have to be, that doesn't mean like having a kind of big theme kind of played on a instrument. traditional instrument, but I do think, you know, because when I think like one of my favourite scores ever is Taxi Driver, and like Bernard Herrmann, I think is one of the, of course, you know, I'm not the only one who thinks this, but it's kind of what I find really interesting is I enjoy writing tunes, but I enjoy also burying them and also abstracting them and kind of making them feel kind of not as, maybe perhaps not declaring them in the same way as those older scores.
Do you feel like we've kind of, because obviously in the 80s with the likes of John Williams, it was, you know, it was very much about melody, very much about hooks. Do you feel that it's modern sort of film score is much less about sort of clearly identifiable melodies and hooks? Or are they just more subtle? I think the film scores that have done really well over the last decade, let's say, have all had some sort of a hook, but it's just not been in a particularly traditional like orchestration all the time. So, off the top of your head, can you think of any that just sort of spring to mind? Well, Joker, I think, is like a really good one because, you know, you just hear that like 2 or 3 note motif that Hilda wrote, and you go like, yeah, you'd recognise it anyway. You know, it's like, and that, of course, that's in a kind of strings context. But I'm trying to think of Mika Levy is another one. She's, you know, Monos was like a film score that I really enjoyed, and that was maybe 2 or 3 kind of main sounds. It was just that kind of bottle flute sound. That was just the 2. That was the hook, you know. I thought it was so good. So those, and I'm trying to think. And then Sicario, I know that's going back a while, but, you know, that's an unusual, you know, that was another score that I think changed, that shifted. That was things. The first one that, when you said that was the first one that sprang to mind for some reason. Yeah. And how we've heard that kind of like descending double bass motif a lot since. So much. But it was so good. Yeah, he is so good. And that did change that landscape. Definitely. Yeah, it's been, because you're right, I totally agree with you. We've heard it loads and loads and loads. And even Arrival, you know, Johan Johansson, the sort of like, the sort of, you know, talk about atonal, but the sort of beautiful pads, and you know, they recorded a lot to tape, didn't they, and sort of slowed it down, and then actually recorded over stuff because you'd have our strange artifacts from the bit you recorded before. Oh, I didn't know that. Stunning, amazing. I'd love to. I'm going to dig out that. Was that a podcast that you listened to that was on that? Which is. Oh, do you know what? I can't even remember. I'm going to Google it. It might have been an article. I think it might be an article I read, actually, because I heard it and I was just so kind of blown away by it. I was like, wow, what's going on there with the kind of the voices as well. And there's a lot of wooden percussion as well, where they were just sort of like banging bits of wood, but actually moving, you know, stereo miking a piece of wood and moving up and down the piece of wood, banging different parts of it to sort of, so not relying on any sort of panning to get this sort of movement. It was actually someone moving up and down, if I remember right. Yeah, there's a good Song Exploder. Yes. Episode on the wood. Oh, is it? Well, I heard about the wood thing. That might be where I've heard it. Maybe. Yeah. Anyway. That might be where I heard it, yeah. Awesome. And just quickly, I mean, in terms of sort of TV, film, can you name certain films or certain shows? I mean, you mentioned Arrival and the sort of films that have changed the sort of soundscape. Were there certain sort of similar seminal movies or TV series which sort of you think have kind of shaped sort of who you are, your appreciation of TV or the visual arts and or music? I think Tarkovsky. Okay. David Lynch. These are just filmmakers, I suppose, but there's kind of... Yeah, no, well... Yeah, and... Can you remember anything as a kid, like going to the cinema and seeing something and just being like, oh, whoa, I do remember kind of seeing things like E.T. Although, actually, if I'm totally honest, I didn't have like the biggest reaction to E.T. I think it was... I was petrified. I scared the shit out of me, did E.T. Because there's this weird thing in E.T. where they shoot below the waist. You don't see, other than, there's only one person, I think it's the mother, you don't see any adults above waist height for the whole film. That's interesting. Which is only retrospectively I recognise that, but that was scary. And then the whole, I enjoyed it, but there was a level of fear with E.T., which actually I think probably took off some of the sheen for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's it, because I remember basically, but again, I remember just like being so, basically, I think my ears did more than my eyes did. I like loved the film so much, but I was so dazzled by the music. I mean, it's one of those, so yeah. And, you know, and also I only found out the other day that E.T. was written by a woman.
Oh, really?
Yes, which made me just very happy.
Like it even more.
Well, you know what I mean? It's like, you know, at that time in the 80s, you know, I didn't, and actually, and when I think about Wendy Carlos, you know, scoring The Shining, and you know, it just that it's a strange one, but because there was such a minority then, it's kind of. And they were such great films. You know, Clockwork Orange was scored by Wendy Carlos. So it's like, although that film, that really scared the absolute. That's a. Yeah.
How old were you when you saw that?
I was too young when I saw that, I think. Right, I saw that when I was like really too young. And it's, I've only seen it once, and it's like images of that are just like seared onto my brain.
The level of trauma.
Yeah, definitely. So good though, but it definitely has influenced. Yeah.
If I'd just like to finish up with a couple of quick-fire questions and a bit of random trivia. So I'm kind of obsessed with like random facts about kind of movies and or soundtracks and scores. Do you have any random facts or? Well,
the only random fact I have that I can think of is a bit of a painful one.
Oh, go on.
And actually, it's another Kubrick one. And I remember learning that it was John North who was initially hired to write the music, and it was before they were doing demos. So the legend goes that Kubrick turned up at the film scoring session and heard the first cue, and just looked at John North and said, "Is it all like that?" And John North said, "Yeah, it is." And they finished the scoring session, but then they replaced the whole score. And I think that is something that he'd been working on for about 2 years. And I think it affected his health. You know, it was a big, but it was a really important story, because I was like, that's the other thing that people say so much in this kind of business, is that people get replaced more than you'd think. You know, it happens a lot. It really does happen a lot. And it's okay. I mean, there are, you know, if you're spending 2 years on a score, that is very, very painful to imagine that, incredibly painful. But that was my first story that I'd ever heard of a composer getting kind of replaced. And it was an important one.
Thank God we can mock up demos on the computer.
Yeah, exactly.
Because to get 2 years down the line and then sort of go, actually, I'm not sure I like this music, it obviously probably wouldn't happen. But there's something Stephen Warbeck touched on, actually, is his agent reckons about 2/5 of composers get sort of sacked during a job, which people, you know, it's not advertised, it's not out there. And it must be really, really hard. But again, at the same time, is sometimes it's not actually about the music, it's just about the relationship and the communication, and sometimes the gap between the director and the composer isn't bridgeable. And in that instance, as you said earlier, sometimes it's better to sort of like take a step back and go, actually, do you know what, maybe I'm not the right person for this. But I'm
sure, like, it's definitely going to happen. I know it's going to happen. I hope it doesn't. But I'm really glad to know about I'm really glad to kind of be like what Stephen said, you know, to have those kind of facts, because writing scores is really intense and it's really hard work, and you do put it's like you put your soul into it, and you have very intense relationships with your collaborators, so it's gonna hurt probably, I think, but most people are pretty kind people, so
sure. Well, yeah, and you know, thank you to you for so sort of generously sharing today, because again, I think I always find it very kind of reaffirming in a positive way when I hear about composers having similar experiences, and when you realise that actually it's totally normal, it happens all the time, it happens to all of us, that it kind of just makes it somewhat easier sort of to handle, to know that it's okay. So thank you for sort of generously sharing all your experiences today. I've got a quick bit of trivia for you.
Oh my God, yes.
Do you know what the first commercially available film soundtrack was?
No, I don't.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
No.
Do you know what year?
Oh gosh, it's going to be... No, I don't.
Have a guess.
Well, is it going to be something crazy like...
Yeah.
But this is where I'm going to kind of really expose my kind of like lack of knowledge in terms of filmmaking.
We can.
dates.
Well,
was it like 1911 or something? Is it like
bit later than that?
1934.
Not far off. It was 1937.
Oh, okay.
But it was such a kind of radically new concept that I think the album was called something like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the soundtrack to the Disney animation movie or whatever, because they had to be really explicit about what this was, because it was the first time that ever a movie soundtrack had been made commercially.
How does it sound?
I don't know. Do you know what? I've not actually listened to it.
I wonder if it's available anywhere.
I imagine you can only listen to it on a gramophone.
Yeah,
it's only available. There's a gramophone app that you plug into Spotify, and you can listen to it through that gramophone.
Wow, that's amazing! I didn't know that. I'd love to hear that.
A couple of quick fire questions for you to finish up.
Yep.
What's your favourite biscuit?
Oh, a custard cream came instantly to mind.
Yeah. Little known fact about Isobel Waller-Bridge?
I'm a bit scared of monkeys.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Like monkeys generally, or is it like, specifically?
It's something that's
gibbons.
It is kind of general. It's because, but I think it's because I watched a film, and I watched one of the a few of the nature shows, the nature programs, and the relationship. It was particularly like the mating. Right, okay. It was like that episode. There's a really amazing program on at the moment called The Mating Game, which I think is the new David Attenborough.
Yes.
And I watched the monkeys one, and I was terrified.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely terrified.
So it sounds like as a youngster you were exposed to basically what is monkey porn, and it's sort of like seriously traumatizing. But
I wasn't that scared of them until, actually, it's really been a kind of a recent thing. It's kind of really only been in the last, so I think there was a film that I watched that did scare me. So, yeah.
Interesting. Well, my next question was, what scares you? So, that kind of double barrel.
I think, what scares me?
Aside from monkeys.
Well, dying scares me. Death scares me.
Yeah.
My loved ones, it's probably more afraid of my loved ones, the death of my loved ones, than I am about my own. Yeah.
And finally, what advice, if any, would you give to your younger self?
To my younger self, I think I would suggest to my younger self to talk more. There was a sort of classic thing when I would something would happen, and then I wouldn't sort of tell anyone about it for about 6 months, and I don't do that anymore, and I stopped doing that a while ago. But I do think, and then actually I think that's why I have had such an intense relationship with music, because I used to pour everything into the music. But I do think talking about your feelings especially if you're, at any age, but definitely I think I remember my 20s as being I don't know about you, but they were very intense. There's lots of big changes happening, and you're kind of starting your life in a way, in one way. And so I think talking. Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, I speak from the perspective of a guy, but I think certainly British culture I'm a product of a generation which wasn't far removed from sort of just keep calm and carry on. Whereas actually talking about things, even by virtue of saying it out loud, changes your relationship to it in a positive way.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful and I think poignant place to to leave it. Isobel, thanks so much for taking the time to chat. It's been, insightful, and thank you for so generously sharing it. It's been, I've loved it. I could go on for the next hour, but
thank you so much for having me. Really, thank you. It's been really
a pleasure.
Lovely to chat.
That's a pleasure. And so, just finally, if people want to kind of find you and what you're up to, where do they go? Some of the music's on Spotify. Yeah.
And I don't know. I sort of I suppose I'm. Someone described me as a reluctant Instagram poster, which is true. But if there's stuff coming up, I tend to kind of put it there.
Yeah, I think you're certainly more enthusiastic about Instagram than I am. Certainly judging by the frequency of your posting. Yeah, I won't go into my hate relationship with social media, but obviously I will be promoting this on social media, and the irony is not lost on me.
Yes, exactly. It's tough. Thanks, Jim.
What's your Instagram handle?
Isobel WB.
Isobel WB. Awesome, Isobel. Thanks so much. Thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, and given that you've listened this far, I feel you might have, then I would be honoured and incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe, rate and review on your podcast platform of choice. By subscribing, you'll automatically be notified each time a new episode drops, and by rating the show, you tell the artificial intelligence that will soon be running the world that this podcast is worth listening to. I certainly get a lot of insights and value from these conversations, and I genuinely hope you do too. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, then you can email me, podcast@larpmusic.com. Larpmusic.com is my digital abode, and the home of the podcast is larpmusic.com/Sync Music Matters Podcast. And Sync Music Matters Podcast is hyphenated. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.